The honourable member for the Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Australian Citizenship Amendment, Allegiance to Australia Bill 2015, is very important in the context of making our country safe, making our country safer, and ensuring that it is the safest place in which to live going forward. Certainly, the review of Australia's counter-terrorism machinery found that the terrorist threat in Australia is worryingly increasing, and the review mentioned specifically that the number of Australians joining extremist groups overseas is on the rise. It found that the number of known sympathisers and supporters of extremists is also, sadly, disturbingly increasing. And it also found that the number of potential terrorists is rising, and we've seen just in recent days just how dreadful people who wish to do those of goodwill bad are causing their dreadful terrorism acts across the world, in Beirut, in Paris and in other places. And we certainly must make sure, as a priority, our first priority of government is to make our nation safer, and that's what I believe, the government believes, that this particular bill is doing. This particular amendment is achieving. Our security agencies are presently managing more than 400 high-priority counter-terrorism investigations, and this number has more than doubled since 2014. That's a sad state of affairs, Deputy Speaker, and it's one that obviously we as a government and as a parliament that we need to act upon, and that's what we're doing with this amendment. Since September just last year, when the National Terrorism Public Alert level was raised to high, and it hasn't been any lower since, 26 people have been charged as a result of 10 counter-terrorism operations. And unbelievably, that's more than a third of all terrorism-related charges since 2001, 14 years ago. Around 110 Australians are currently fighting or engaged with terrorist groups in Syria and northern Iraq. And that angers me because, as the federal member for Riverina, my hometown is Wagga Wagga, and just southwest of Wagga Wagga is the Kapooka Army Base, the Army Recruit Training Centre, where Blamey Barracks turns out each and every one of the recruits, young, some not so young, men and women, best and bravest, who receive their basic training, undergo a rigorous assessment and march out of Kapooka to join that long tradition of khaki, that long line which has stretched from the Anzac tradition, stretched way back from Gallipoli forward to today. And it angers me that those good people who are willing to serve our country, who are willing to be put in harm's way, who are willing to risk their lives, and to think that they may well be sent overseas. Many of them are, and they may come up against fellow citizens carrying dual citizenship, who do not deserve to be called Australians. Those who are holding dual citizenship and who want to fight against our brave soldiers, our brave Air Force personnel, our wonderful sailors in the Navy. They do not deserve to be called Australian if they want to take up arms against their fellow citizens, and if they are dual citizenship, they hold dual nationality. And you only have to read the Oath of Allegiance, the affirmation of allegiance, at any citizenship ceremony, where the words are stated, from this time forward, in some cases under God is submitted, I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. Or taking arms against your fellow man and woman from your own nation is not respecting Australia's democratic beliefs, is not upholding this great nation's laws. And I want to read in the Parliament a a speech given by Aurora Cadell from Yenda Public School, just 10 years of age when she presented this speech in a multicultural competition in 2014. And I visited the school last year and I heard this fine young lady read this speech to her school. And it's entitled "What Makes a Community?" And I think if a 10-year-old girl can understand what makes a community, particularly a multicultural community such as Yenda, then most other people, and anybody who wants to criticise this particular bill, they should get it as well, that we are a very multicultural nation. We are a very welcoming country, but we do not deserve to be a safe haven for people who come and under dual citizenship wish to do their fellow citizens harm. Now, Yenda is a little town, population just over 1,500 people, according to the 2011 census, 16 kilometres east of Griffith, and in March 2012 it was flooded by Marul Creek. And I say that because in the context of Aurora's speech, that's necessary to know. And Aurora, in her wonderful and eloquent words, said this: "What makes a community? We all know that the answer to this question is people, their relationships, their diversity and the spaces that they share. My community is just like this. It has a post office, tennis courts, a football team, an awesome soccer club, a not-so-supermarket, a park, 2 schools, a pizza shop and a couple of churches, take your pick, a busy hairdresser and, as Dad reminds me, a pub, not to mention all the nice people. Like Peter at the servo, he's a second-generation Italian migrant. Mum asks him about the weather and gardening. There's Tappy the butcher. He gives us lollipops and Mum always gets stuck talking to him for ages. There is George, our Egyptian chemist. He gives us chocolate if we're lucky. He and Mum love to chat. Oh, and there's the new bloke at the shop. He's Indian. I think he's nice. Mum is trying to talk him into getting takeaway Indian food in the shop on Friday nights because by the time we get home from school, after all that talking, she doesn't feel like cooking dinner. These people are an all-important part of our community, but there is something deeper too, a feeling that can only be described with a story. May I tell you a story? Once upon a time, not so long ago, there was a little town in the middle of nowhere. Actually, to be more accurate, it was slightly to the left of the middle of nowhere. And this town was not so different from any small town. But in this little town, something incredibly unusual happened. You see, one night it rained, and it rained hard. The rain thumped the town's roofs all through the night and made the birds' nests into swimming pools. It flooded the yards and streets, and fish actually swam up and down the roads the next day. It was kind of magical that day, but the next day things changed. We were ordered to evacuate, and our town went underwater for the next 3 days in a giant flood. This is where our story becomes a little sad. The flood destroyed lots of possessions. It severely damaged buildings and it even drowned many pets. It meant that our little community had to live in an emergency accommodation while their houses were being fixed. This took a long time. For my house, over a year, and for others even longer. Some houses were demolished altogether. Yenda became a ghost town. But something else happened too. Our community grew closer. Here we all were, no longer in our homes or our schools, not eating our local pizza, but we were still a community. Whenever we crossed each other's paths at the emergency centre, outside the temporary school or anywhere else, we stopped to talk to one another. Our parents shared stories, cried together and helped one another. Us kids played as usual. We all got to know each other a little bit more as we shared each other's lives in ways that we would not have done otherwise. We were a townspeople without a town, but we were still a community. You see, what makes a community is not simply a gathering of buildings that people live and work in. That's just bricks, blocks and mortar. A community is a group of people with a shared experience and who help one another when it's needed, who share in each other's ups and downs. A community is its people, each and every one of them. Now, if little Aurora Cadell from Yenda Public School, aged 10, can get it, then so should all of us. So should all of us understand what community is, what multiculturalism. And there's no greater example of multiculturalism than the Riverina. Indeed, in Griffith, just after South Sudan became an independent nation, they flew 99 flags. And I was asked when South Sudan actually became independent to provide a flag for their Australia Day ceremony because they wanted to fly the flag of the new nation, which meant that there were 100 flags flown at the Griffith Australia Day ceremony. Griffith is the multicultural cradle of Australia, and despite the fact that they have a large Indigenous population, despite the fact that they have nations from all corners of the globe, they get on remarkably well. It's a melting pot of multiculturalism, but the community is remarkable. It is, and I would invite the member for Chifley, if he's got nothing better to do one day, than to come out and actually experience the wonderful community that is Griffith, because it is a remarkable community. They get on so well. They're very resilient, I must say, Deputy Speaker. What was that? What are the lattes like? I don't drink latte, but I tell you what they do provide. They grow and provide all the very best food that you could ever hope, member for Chifley.
They do have white coffee.
There is no better place to have to enjoy a meal than in Griffith, and it's all homegrown food. You would love it, trust me. And I say this in the context of this particular bill. I say this in the context of this particular bill because Griffith understands that providing a safe haven for migrants. My goodness, they were flooded with them just after World War I, and certainly our returning soldiers from that deadly conflict were offered soldier settlers blocks. But the flood of migrants after World War II was quite remarkable. Italians, persecuted people from war-ravaged Europe, all descended upon Griffith to eke out a very tough existence. In that what was an unforgiving plain, but they've turned it into a fertile Garden of Eden. And I say all that because they understand what it means to be a multicultural community. They understand also what it is to be an Australian citizen. And I have to say, when I go to Griffith and talk to the many Indians, to the many Fijians, to people from all walks of life, and of course, as I said before, the many Italians, they get the fact that what it means to be an Australian. Many of them haven't been here that many generations, but certainly they are very proud of their community. They're very proud of their European roots, but they also understand that what it means to be an Australian is to fight very hard to protect the ideals, to protect the high qualities and the preferences that our nation has provided, and they understand that it is absolutely criminal to rise up and oppose those high ideals, that very high calibre of being an Australian. Now, this bill understands and goes to the fact that citizenship should be respected and never, ever taken for granted. As this bill states, Parliament recognises that Australian citizenship is a common bond involving reciprocal rights and obligations, and that citizens may, through certain conduct incompatible with the shared values of the Australian community, demonstrate that they have severed that bond and repudiated their allegiance to Australia. We get that. The new powers in the bill are necessary. They are an appropriate response to the evolution of the terrorist threat. The terrorist threat that lingers in the hearts and minds, sadly, of those people who wave that terrible black flag and who call themselves the Islamic State. They are not a state. A state builds things. A state looks after its people. A state, understands the freedom to express religious beliefs and different faiths. A state understands that there ought to be fairness, there ought to be equality. A state does not tear down. A state does not destroy. A state does not kill. And this is why this Australian Citizenship Amendment is so important. Now, I have to say, Aurora gets it. I think her words beautifully depict what it means to be an Australian. Her words eloquently describe what it means to be a citizen of this great nation. And she, like all her Yenda public school mates, and I would dare suggest every one of the kids who are in a Riverina school, they understand how great it is to live in this great nation, and the passing of this bill will also mean that this nation is going to be a safer place, that we will not tolerate people who want to kill and destroy in the name of a religion, who want to kill and destroy in the name of terrorists, and they understand that it is important that this nation is the safest of all in which to live, and that is why I commend this bill to the House.
The question is the bill